So what are the techniques to improve writing? Well, the first idea that we'll explore this semester is how to write simply. We often have this fake and realistic impression that the more adjectives you stuff into your sentences, the more extravagant it looks. But in fact, good writing is simple. It's straight to the point, and we'll talk about some of the examples this semester that will really illustrate this. The second point is using simple words, simple sentences, and practicing brevity. Another point is eliminating jargon and cliches, because it really overloads your story with unnecessary repetitive words. And we'll talk about this later today as well. Then using familiar words or using the terms and words that you understand and your readers understand as well. Varying sentence type and length, as well as varying attributions after quotes. Building sentences around nouns and verbs, and we'll talk more about this next week, about how nouns and verbs should be the central element of your writing and not adjectives that actually overload your sentences. And the last one is using transitions to link sentences and paragraphs to make sure that your writing is logical and coherent and that the story flows. Let's move on to the next slide. So a couple of examples that I wanted to discuss. That's the headline from the New York Times. The headline says, Trump's message, the economy is great, but we need a big stimulus. Very short headline, straight to the point, and it tells you what the message is, right? It tells you that the very substance of what the story is going to be about. Another headline that is very short and straight to the point. Trump, Greenland, Denmark. Is this real life? So that's an opinion column, and that's actually a pretty intriguing headline. It makes you wonder what it is about. It gives you a little bit of a clue of what the opinion column is going to be about. It has a question, so it asks something from readers. So again, a very intriguing headline that makes people want to click on it. Another good headline, CEOs should fear a recession. It could mean revolution. So you actually have phonetical repetition in this headline that repeats, that has words that sound slightly similar to each other, I mean in terms of the sounds that they make. Recession, revolution, and the length of both sentences in this headline. So as a result, it creates this effect that makes it very memorable. Here's another example of a headline that's actually a bad example of a headline. I got this one from Daily Mail. The headline, Angela Merkel shares a toast with Boris Johnson after saying the EU can do a new Brexit deal to ditch the backstop in the next 30 days as the pair hold showdown talks in Berlin. Do you have the feeling like at the end of this headline you already forgot what the beginning was about? That's an example of the headline that's not very efficient and not very effective. Most likely, as a reader, you wouldn't even spend your time trying to figure out what it's trying to say. And now compare it to this headline from the New York Times. CEOs should fear a recession. It could mean revolution. It's very straight to the point. It's short. It has phonetical repetition as an attention trigger. And it really makes you want to click on it. That's just an example of what a good headline looks like compared to a bad headline, or not so efficient of a headline. Saying that, let's move on to the next slide and take another couple of examples. So what did I mean when I said use simple words? Let's compare these two examples. One sentence. It says participants with high genetic risk and an unfavorable lifestyle were almost 3 times more likely to develop dementia versus those with a low genetic risk and favorable lifestyle. However, the risk of dementia was 32% lower in people with a high genetic risk if they had followed a healthy lifestyle compared to those with an unhealthy lifestyle. So many unnecessary words are repeated here that at some point you, again, just forget what it's all about. And it's very hard to get to the very bottom of it. What's the major thought that the author is trying to say? Most likely, and that's a quote from a real news story, most likely the author just copied and pasted a quote from a study. And that's what you are not supposed to do as a reporter when you come across some types of narratives that are full of jargon, may it be officials jargon or scientific jargon. For ordinary audiences, this is just too heavy of a sentence to stop and read and think about it. Now compare it with another sentence, which states exactly the same thought. Some people believe it's inevitable they'll develop dementia because of their genetics. This research, however, says this may not be the case. Isn't it clear? It's so straight to the point that right away you know what the story is going to be about, compared to the first example, where it would take you a minute or two rereading it several times, trying to figure out what the author is trying to tell. Again, that's what I mean when I say use simple words. Sometimes the more simple it is, the better. Let's move on to the next example. When I talk about brevity being essential in headlines, here's a real headline that I found online. The headline: a major new study suggests it's possible to avoid developing dementia. 5 ways to reduce your risk. Super long, and just look at all those words I highlighted that are so unnecessary here. A major new study. Well, first of all, who said it's major? Okay, if they discovered a whole new parallel universe, we could say it's a major study. But this is just a regular study on dementia, right? Another unnecessary group of words that we can identify here. The study suggests it's possible to avoid developing dementia. Possible to avoid developing dementia. It sounds like a lot of these words are redundant, and you can just shorten the headline. You can just say a major new study suggests you can reduce your risk of dementia. Possible to avoid developing dementia. That's just such a heavy word construct that could be easily avoided. And that's just one example of what you would do as an editor and as a writer when you edit your own work. So let's move on to the next slide and take a look at it. So we had this point when we said we should eliminate jargon, cliches, and bureaucratic terms, especially when you report on politics, social life, scientific discoveries. There's a lot of jargon that people don't really understand, or bureaucratic terms that overload the sentence when it's not really necessary. So one example here. The term public charge is a legal term of art that specifically refers to a person who is or is liable to become totally dependent upon government assistance for his/her survival. It encompasses those who live in abject poverty and are without the tools to lift themselves out of that state through gainful employment. Clearly, the author from Fox News here just copied and pasted a piece of legislation. Sometimes it's necessary when you write about law for professionals, but when you write for people, the obvious thought here in the sentence is that the term public charge means a poor person that can't provide for themselves, that is going to be a burden for the social welfare system. And that's what the term public charge is used for. Basically, a person that cannot provide for themselves because they're poor or they don't make enough money. So why don't you use those simple words to explain what it is, instead of just copying and pasting the whole super heavy, overloaded bureaucratic sentence from the legislation? Again, if you write for a professional law journal, that might make total sense for law professionals. But if you write a news story for regular audiences, this might be a little bit excessive. So let's move on to the next one. So when we talk about cliches, and that's a pretty common issue with headlines, you can see cliches. Just one example of what a cliche looks like in the headline. Avoid like the plague. You can see that pretty much in every second headline, especially if you look up this sentence. There's so many headlines that use the same exact sort of formula, to that extent that this became a cliche. It's too overused. So here are just several examples. Just by doing an easy Google search, I found 4, 5, easily 10 headlines that have this same cliche. Avoid buying modern apartments like the bubonic plague, expert warns. Avoid these 50 business cliches like the plague. TFSA investors, 3 stocks to avoid like the plague. Why you should avoid CamTrust stock like the plague. At some point, it just becomes so overused that it almost looks like bad taste in writing. When too many headlines use the same exact formula, it becomes overused and boring for the reader. So that's definitely not the type of headline that people would click on or enjoy reading. So let's move on to the next one. So sentence typology. We're going to quickly take a look at 4 different types of sentences just to make sure we know what we're talking about when we try and create news stories later this semester. So we have simple sentences, complex sentences, compound, and compound complex sentences. What are those 4 types? A simple sentence has only one independent clause, subject plus verb, and that combination creates a complete thought. An example of a simple sentence: I am moving to New York. A complex sentence contains subordinate clause or clauses. Here's an example: whether my friend supports it or not, I am moving to New York. In this case, your subordinate clause would be whether my friend supports it or not. A compound sentence connects at least 2 independent clauses. Here's an example: I am moving to New York, and my best friend is moving to San Diego. Both parts of this sentence are independent, so they're independent clauses, because in separation, on their own, they're still a complete thought. And that would be a compound sentence. And then the 4th kind, a compound complex sentence. It connects at least 2 independent and at least 1 dependent clause. So here, for example, we can say, whether our family is supported or not, I'm moving to New York, and my friend is moving to San Diego. So you have a compound complex sentence because you have 2 independent clauses. I'm moving to New York, my friend is moving to San Diego. They don't depend on each other. They're complete sentences and thoughts on their own. And then you have 1 dependent clause, whether our family is supported or not. Because without the rest of the sentence, it won't make sense. You can't just say whether our family is supported or not, period, right? It won't make any sense without the context, which means it's a dependent clause, and the combination of 2 independent and 1 dependent clause creates a compound complex sentence.